This Boros deck adopts the fundamentals of a traditional spell-slinging build, in colors generally unbefitting of the archetype, and warps it under the direction and guidance of its commander. With numerous win conditions in the 99 dependent on casting spells, the unique and genuinely non-Boros ability of exiling and returning instant and sorcery spells provides the shell of this spell-slinging value engine. However, true Boros fans can rejoice. Although this build has very few creature spells, the deck does possess the potential to win via combat due to a peripheral sub-theme of creature token creation, in addition to the threat our general poses by potentially one-shotting an opponent with lethal commander damage. Feather the Redeemed debuted in War of the Spark and is a 3/4 angel with flying for 1 red and 2 white mana. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature we control, we exile that card instead of putting it into our graveyard as it resolves. If we do, then we return it to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. Feather is one of, if not the most, non-traditional legendary Boros creatures in the history of Magic the Gathering. She helms a deck that is dedicated to win primarily through casting instant and sorcery spells in Boros colors. Her ability of recycling these spells upon resolution enhances the spell-slinging payoffs inundating the 99 of this deck. With a focus on efficiently costed instant spells, we can cast these spells multiple times during a round of turns. The benefits we reap from this dynamic will leave our opponents overwhelmed as we out-resource and out-tempo them on the path to imminent victory. Building a land base for a 2-color deck is pretty straightforward. We include as many 2-color lands as our tempo threshold permits, sprinkle in some thematically specific utility lands, and then fill out the land base with basic lands. With that formula in mind, this deck has 10 plains and 10 mountains. In a way, we can look at these basic lands as placeholders for future 2-color lands that have not yet been created, or for already existing 2-color lands for which copies have not become available yet. Remember our aforementioned measuring stick of tempo thresholds? For a deck that can start revving its spell-slinging engine rather quickly, we do not want it to stall by including too many lands that enter the battlefield tapped. The balance between color fixing and tempo is important, even in 2-color builds. With that in mind, Temple of Triumph and Needle Spires are the only 2-color lands in the deck that come into play tapped without any conditions attached to untap them. When the Temple comes into play, we scry 1. We can pay 2 generic mana, a red and a white, to have Needle Spires become a 2/1 red and white elemental creature with double strike until end of turn. This temporary double striking elemental can sneak in for chunks of combat damage at a time. There are several other lands in this deck that could enter the battlefield tapped if certain requirements are not met. Clifftop Retreat is a check land and comes into play tapped unless we control a mountain or a plains. Spectator Seating follows suit, but this fan land's untapped condition requires us to have at least 2 opponents. We must have at least 2 other lands to have our Boros slow land, Sundown Pass, come into play untapped. We must control no more than 2 other lands to have Inspiring Vantage, our Boros fast land, enter the battlefield untapped. Of these 4 options, only Inspiring Vantage seems likely to come into play tapped the majority of the time. There are some dual-color lands in this build that could cost us life. Sacred Foundry is our appropriate shock land, and it comes into play tapped unless we pay 2 life. Battlefield Forge is our pain land, and we can tap it to add a colorless mana, or we can tap it to add a red or white mana and take 1 point of damage. Sunbaked Canyon is our horizon land, and we can tap it and pay 1 life to add a red or white mana to our mana pool. We can also pay 1 mana, tap it, and sacrifice it to draw a card. Rugged Prairie is our filter land. It taps to add 1 colorless mana, or we can pay a red or a white mana, tap it, and either add 2 red mana, a red and a white mana, or 2 white mana to our mana pool. Oh, and of course, we have the best land in the format, Command Tower. It taps to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. Best land in the format. Although not technically dual-colored lands, pathways provide 2 sides from which to choose, and here we can put our Boros pathway into play as either Needle Verge pathway or Pillar Verge pathway. It does help to fix our mana immediately, but we lose the versatility of it providing one of 2 different colors of mana throughout the game. Even so, this land is still worthy of inclusion in this deck. With our colored mana-producing lands now showcased, we move on to our utility lands. The importance of Reliquary Tower's ability cannot be overstated in this type of build. It gives us no maximum hand size. Remember, as we draw cards and cast instant and sorcery spells with our general on our side of the battlefield, these spells return to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. Also remember, our discard step happens after our end step, and if we have more than 7 cards in our hand, then this turn-based action forces us to discard enough cards to reduce our hand size down to 7. We want these cards in our hand and not discarded into our graveyard. Redundancy is our friend secondary to this no maximum hand size ability, and for the purposes of foreshadowing, it will be discussed again. Myriad Landscape comes into play tapped. We can tap it to add a colorless mana, or we can pay 2 mana, tap it, and sacrifice it to search our library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a land type and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Here, we sacrifice a little tempo when Myriad Landscape enters the battlefield, but we make up for it by eventually turning this 1 land into 2. Closing out the land portion of this deck are some utility combat options. We can pay a red and a white mana and tap Slayer's Stronghold to have target creature get +2/+0, vigilance, and haste until end of turn. We can pay 2 generic mana, a red and a white, and tap Sunhome, Fortress of the Legion, to have target creature gain double strike until end of turn. Lastly, we can pay 4 mana and tap Rogue's Passage to make target creature unblockable until end of turn. Note that the abilities of these lands can target any creature, and not just ours. The Boros Guild is not just filled with warmongers, they can politic too. Historically, Boros has not been inundated with mana ramp and card advantage options. The times are slowly changing, and some of these more recent options have found their way into this build. Before we continue, let's roll out some of the usual suspects in Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, and Talisman of Conviction. Sol Ring taps to add 2 colorless mana, Arcane Signet taps to add 1 mana of any color from our commander's color identity, and the Talisman taps to add a colorless mana, or taps to add a red or a white mana, and deals 1 point of damage to us. Thought Vessel closes out our mana rocks for this build. It is the artifact version of Reliquary Tower, and provides some much-needed redundancy for keeping cards in our hand and out of the graveyard. At the beginning of our upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than we do, then land tax allows us the option of searching our library for up to 3 basic land cards, reveal them, and put them into our hand. Note that the majority of the lands in this deck are basic lands, so land tax should not run out of basic lands to put into our hand, which helps to ensure that we never miss a land drop. Smothering Tithe adds a tax of 2 mana to an opponent whenever they draw a card. If the player does not pay it, then we create a treasure token, for which we can tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. This form of mana acceleration can produce very favorable resources if our opponents decide not to pay the tax. For the purposes of drawing cards, we can rely on Skull Clamp. It gives equipped creature +1/+1, and whenever it dies, we draw 2 cards. Although this build is not teeming with creatures, and also is not a dedicated creature token deck, there are a few creature token creating options that synergize with our spell-slinging theme. Equipping Skull Clamp to these creature tokens should result in us drawing 2 cards, which is a great return on the investment of 1 mana and a sacrificial creature token. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, Esper Sentinel has us draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. The taxes are beginning to pile up, and if our opponents are unwilling to pay them, then our resources will continue to expand. Giving us the best of both worlds secondary to mana acceleration and card draw abilities is Smuggler's Share. At the beginning of each end step, we draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn. We also create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. What do Magic players love to do? Draw cards and ramp mana, and this enchantment rewards us for them doing so. We have no shortage of removal spells in our colors, so let's begin with 2 stalwarts in Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile. These instants have mana values of just 1 white mana and exile target creature. These creatures' controllers respectively gain life equal to the exiled creature's power, or search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Best creature removal in Magic. Wear and Tear has the Fuse mechanic, which allows us to cast both halves of the card from our hand. Wear destroys target artifact, and Tear destroys target enchantment. For a generic mana and Boros colors, we can do both. When destroying artifacts and enchantments is not enough, we have Return to Dust. This instant exiles target artifact or enchantment, but if we cast this spell during our main phase, then we may exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment as well. Into the Core exiles 2 target artifacts. Not having targets for Into the Core at the EDH table would be as rare as winter roses. For permanent interaction, we have Chaos Warp and Oblation. Chaos Warp has the owner of target permanent shuffle it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. Oblation follows suit, except the owner of target permanent draws 2 cards instead of revealing the top card of their library. Note that these instant spells can target any permanents on the battlefield, and not just our opponents. Note the synergies among our General, our aforementioned creature tokens, and Oblation. We can target one of our creature tokens with Oblation, draw 2 cards, and have Feather exile it and return it to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. Reckless Rage deals 4 damage to target creature we don't control, and 2 damage to target creature we control. Dealing 4 points of damage can remove a litany of creatures from the battlefield. Note that our General has a toughness of 4. If we target Feather with Reckless Rage, then we return it to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. We can manage the battlefield during a round of turns through this dynamic, and all for just 1 red mana each time. Reckless Rage is one of the most impactful spells in this build. For additional direct damage removal, Soul's Fire has target creature we control deal damage equal to its power to any target. This instant can deal with creatures or planeswalkers, but it also could one-shot an opponent if the power of our creature is high enough. And in this deck, it very well could be. We rely on our spot removal spells to manage the battlefield. Due to the importance of our General, most of our mass removal spells in this build keep Feather out of harm's way. Most, but not all. For mass removal spells in our colors, Wrath of God is an easy inclusion. Destroy all creatures, and they cannot be regenerated. For some mass removal spells that rid the battlefield of our opponent's creatures while leaving our General alone, we have Winds of Abandon and Chandra's Ignition. If we pay the overload cost for Winds of Abandon, then we exile each creature we do not control. For each creature exiled this way, its controller searches their library for a basic land card and puts it onto the battlefield tapped. This can be risky, as we are most likely ensuring that our opponent's mana resources propel them well ahead of our own. However, the exile effect of the spell does not target creatures, so creatures with Shroud, Hexproof, Ward, Indestructible, and other forms of protection are exiled easily and not sent to the graveyard. where far too many graveyard-centric strategies and shenanigans are prevalent. For a different approach, Chandra's Ignition has target creature we control deal damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. This sorcery has the potential to remove all of our opponent's creatures from the battlefield, and it also has the potential to be a win condition. Either way, Feather remains on the battlefield with these two mass removal options. Since this deck is a dedicated spell-slinging build, we can enhance this theme by including some spell-slinging payoffs. We can tap Thermo Alchemist to deal 1 point of damage to each opponent, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we untap him. We can string together a lot of direct damage through this tap-untap synergy. Gutter Snipe and Young Pyromancer also have abilities that trigger whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell. Gutter Snipe deals 2 damage to each opponent, while Young Pyromancer creates a 1/1 red elemental creature token. Stormkiln Artist extends its triggered ability to any time we copy or cast an instant or sorcery spell. When we do, we create a treasure token. This Dwarf Shaman also gets +1/+0 for each artifact we control. Note the synergy among the Artist, Feather, and any instant spell that costs 1 mana to cast. We can basically cast this instant spell for free multiple times with the treasure tokens created by Stormkiln Artist. We also have some cards with abilities that trigger whenever we cast non-creature spells, and not just instants and sorceries. Monastery Master creates a 1/1 white monk creature token with Prowess. The Mentor also has Prowess, which means that whenever we cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. In this type of build, these prowess-laden creature tokens can become powerful threats to our opponents. Manaform Hellkite follows suit and creates an XX red Dragon Illusion creature token with flying and haste, where X is equal to the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. This token is exiled at the beginning of the next end step. Although their presence on the battlefield is temporary, their potential impact on the game resonates much longer. Note that these creature tokens are created whenever we cast a non-creature spell, which also can be during our opponent's turns. They are still exiled at the beginning of the next end step, but they can be utilized as blockers if needed. We put a lore counter on Scroll of the Masters whenever we cast a non-creature spell. We can pay 3 mana and tap it to give target creature +1/+1 until end of turn for each lore counter on Scroll of the Masters. This artifact provides strategic combat chicanery and should cause a lot of headaches for our opponents. We can easily accumulate enough lore counters on this artifact to use it to boost Feather's power to one-shot an opponent with lethal commander damage. Speaking of one-shotting an opponent, Aetherflux Reservoir is another spell-slinging win condition in this build. Whenever we cast a spell, we gain 1 life for each spell we've cast this turn. We can pay 50 life and deal 50 damage to any target. With the number of spells we can sling during a round of turns, we should have no trouble activating the Reservoir's direct damage dealing ability. Speaking of dealing direct damage, Aria of Flame can deliver victory through this dynamic. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent gains 10 life. Our challenge here is to overlook this gift of life and heighten our mindfulness to the end game, because whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we put a verse counter on Aria of Flame. It then deals damage equal to the number of verse counters on it to target player or planeswalker. With Feather leading our spell-slinging engine, our opponents will quickly lose that gifted life, and a whole lot more. Casting instant and sorcery spells is not enough to trigger Feather's ability. We must target our creatures with these spells in order to return them to our hand at the beginning of the next end step. Since this deck is crafted around Feather's ability, if we include any creatures with abilities that trigger when they are targeted with spells, then we enhance our theme even further. The heroic mechanic perfectly synergizes with the theme of this deck, and both Phalanx Leader and Vanguard of Brimaz have it. Whenever we cast a spell that targets either of these creatures, they respectively put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control and create a 1/1 white cat soldier creature token with vigilance. This is an example of the rich getting richer. Speaking of riches, whenever Goldspan Dragon attacks or becomes the target of a spell, we create a treasure token. Note that this ability triggers whenever any spell targets Goldspan Dragon, and not just ours. Goldspan Dragon also has an ability that gives treasures we control the ability to add 2 mana of any one color to our mana pool when we tap and sacrifice them. RC Sharpshooter and RC Acrobatic Coup provide a powerful synergistic dynamic in this type of build. We want to cast this spell for its more than meets the eye cost of a red and a white mana. When we do, it enters the battlefield converted as RC Acrobatic Coup. This legendary artifact vehicle has the Living Metal mechanic, which means that as long as it is our turn, this vehicle is also a creature. Note that this ability prevents our opponents from destroying this side of RC with any creature removal spells during their turns, since she is not a creature. While she is the Coup, whenever we cast a spell that targets one or more creatures or vehicles we control, we put that many +1/+1 counters on RC and then convert her. RC converts into the Sharpshooter, and we can pay 1 mana and remove one or more +1/+1 counters from RC to deal that much damage to target creature, and then we convert her back into the Coup. Through this process of flipping back and forth, we are rewarded with targeted direct damage creature removal as a peripheral benefit for engaging in our spell-slinging theme. Thank you, RC. Zada Hedron Grinder has a heroic-like ability that targets each of our other creatures. Whenever we cast a spell that targets only Zada, we copy that spell for each other creature we control that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Example, if we target Zada with a spell that gives it +3/+3 until end of turn, then that spell is copied for each other creature we control, and then targets each one of these creatures with a copy. In this scenario, all of our creatures get +3/+3 until end of turn. This dynamic can get out of hand very, very quickly. For a much riskier option, Mirrorwing Dragon mimics Zada's spell copying ability, but also allows our opponents to take advantage of it as well. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Mirrorwing Dragon, that player copies that spell for each other creature they control that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. In our earlier example with Zada, if an opponent targets Mirrorwing Dragon with a spell that gives it +3/+3 until end of turn, then that opponent copies that spell for each of their creatures and targets each one of them with one of the copies. As a result, all of that opponent's creatures get +3/+3 until end of turn. As stated earlier, it is a risky option, but once again, redundancy is our friend here, and the risk of Mirrorwing Dragon's ability being shared among our opponents is not greater than the rewards we can reap from its inclusion in this build. The primary goal of this spell-slinging engine we have showcased throughout this video is to amass more resources than our opponents, which makes it easier to dispatch them and win the game. For the purposes of expediting this process, we have selected a slate of low-costed instant spells that have us draw cards in addition to other effects. Since they are instants, they can be cast during our opponent's turns in order to maximize our general's ability, all of which combine to form a card-drawing machine, the likes of which no Boros deck had ever considered prior to Feather hitting the scene. Expedite and Accelerate give target creature haste. Crimson Wisps has target creature become red, and it also gains haste until end of turn. For more until end of turn abilities, Defiant Strike gives target creature +1/+0. Guided Strike gives target creature +1/+0 and First Strike. Fists of Flames gives target creature trample and +1/+0 for each card we've drawn this turn. Psychotic Fury gives target multicolored creature double strike and is a perfect way to one-shot an opponent with a juiced-up Feather. Niveus Wisps has target creature become white until end of turn, and it becomes tapped. Bandage prevents the next 1 damage that would be dealt to target creature or player this turn. Carom has the next 1 damage dealt to target creature this turn dealt to another target creature instead. Shelter gives target creature protection from the color of our choice until end of turn. Speaking of protection, Feather is a lightning rod for attention because of her ability to completely take over a game. Since protecting her is so important, we have a slew of instant spells that provide various levels of security. God's Willing gives protection from the color of our choice until end of turn. Sheltering Light gives indestructible until end of turn, and Boon of Safety puts a shield counter on target creature, which means that if this creature would be dealt damage or destroyed, we remove a shield counter from it instead. Note that these spells also have us scry 1. Blacksmith's Skill and Lauren's Escape give target creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. If it is an artifact creature, Blacksmith's Skill gives it +2/+2 until end of turn, and Lauren's Escape also has a scry 1. We have a few more instant spells to showcase from this deck. These spells are moto spells that could target a creature we control, but also provide other options as well. Invigorated Rampage either gives target creature +4/+0 when trample until end of turn, or gives 2 target creatures +2/+0 when trample until end of turn instead. As we have demonstrated already, the first mode of this spell could be considered a game winner when copied and utilized for an army of creature tokens. The oh-so-underrated Dawn Charm regenerates target creature we control, prevents all combat damage that will be dealt this turn, or counters target spell that targets us. The regeneration mode fits into the theme of this build quite well, and it may be a surprise that our opponents are not suspecting, and its other 2 modes are very relevant forms of protection. Speaking of protection, Boros Charm can give permanents we control indestructible until end of turn. It also can deal 4 damage to target player or planeswalker, or can give target creature double strike until end of turn. This temporary double strike enablement could be considered a game ender when copied and utilized for an army of creature tokens. Now it's time to bring this deck tech to a close with a few more cards that synergize with and enhance our spell-slinging theme. With protection still fresh in our minds, we have a copy of Swiftfoot Boots to help protect our general. It gives equipped creature hexproof and haste. Let's not make the mistake of playing with Lightning Greaves here or any other forms of Shroud enablement. Remember, a creature with Shroud cannot be targeted by any spells or abilities, and in this creature-light build, targeting Feather is something we may be doing early, often, and frequently during the game. Enlightened Tutor searches our library for an artifact or enchantment card, we shuffle, and then put that card on top of our library. This tutor is perfect for grabbing a needed artifact or enchantment, particularly if we are 1 win condition away from claiming victory. Seize the Day can be a repeatable source of gaining additional combat phases. We untap target creature, and after this main phase, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. With Feather on our side of the battlefield, she returns this sorcery to our hand for us to use again and again and again, giving us an additional combat phase each and every time. Note that the creature does not have to be tapped in order for Seize the Day to target it. Livewire Lash gives equipped creature +2/+0 and has, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell, this creature deals 2 damage to any target. Note that this ability triggers whenever the equipped creature becomes a target of any spell, and not just our opponents. Veilstone Amulet is a lesser-known artifact that gives creatures we control hexproof until end of turn whenever we cast a spell. This synergizes perfectly with this deck as a source to protect our creatures peripherally through our spell-slinging theme. Lastly, we have a couple of cards that diversify from where we can cast our spells. Underworld Breach gives each non-land card in our graveyard Escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost, plus we have to exile 3 other cards from our graveyard. At the beginning of the end step, we sacrifice Underworld Breach. This enchantment gives us 1 turn to recast any spells from our graveyard through their escape-enabled abilities. Perhaps 1 or more of our win conditions are in the graveyard. Maybe some key instant spells are in the graveyard. It's possible that we need a removal spell. Underworld Breach gives us these opportunities, but for just 1 turn. Note that Feather will return any of these spells to our hand through her ability at the beginning of the next end step, as long as they target a creature we control. It is not stipulated where these spells must be cast in order to trigger Feather's ability, just that they are cast. Sunforger can cast spells straight from our library and for free. It gives equipped creature +4/+0, and we can pay a red and a white mana and unattached Sunforger to search our library for a red or a white instant card with mana value 4 or less and cast that card without paying its mana cost. Every instant spell in this deck can be tutored for with this equipment, which is nearly half of all the spells in the 99 of this build. Note that Feather will return any of these instants to our hand through her ability at the beginning of the next end step, as long as they target a creature we control. Once again, it is not stipulated where these spells must be cast in order to trigger Feather's ability, just that they are cast. Hopefully, our opponent's ability to continue playing Magic with us in the future won't change as a result. This Feather the Redeemed build has been added to the Burgeoning Commander Catalog, and this video also becomes the starting point of a Feather the Redeemed EDH deck video primer series. These playlist series can be accessed in the description below, on our YouTube page, or at the end of this video. The Burgeoning Commander Catalog is my personal collection of EDH decks. An EDH deck video primer series showcases the continued evolution of a deck through future appearances on the Up and Up series, during which we update and upgrade decks featured on this channel. The full card list for this build can be found in the description, and be sure to share your thoughts about this Feather the Redeemed deck in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, yo channel for all things Magic.